Heat, the kind of heat that bends light over asphalt, that makes the horizon shimmer like a mirage. It was the summer of 1987, and Dr. Eleanor Vance stood at the edge of what remained of the old exposition grounds in Chicago. The grass had long since reclaimed the pathways, but beneath her feet she could feel it, the geometry, the perfect, impossible geometry of foundations that should not exist. Eleanor was 53 years old, a professor of architectural history at Northwestern University, and she had spent the last 20 years of her life studying buildings that made no sense, not in the way that modern architecture sometimes confuses, with its deliberate asymmetry and calculated chaos, but in a deeper, more unsettling way. Buildings whose construction methods remained unexplained, structures whose scale defied the technology of their supposed era. Monuments that appeared fully formed in photographs, as if conjured from nothing, only to vanish within decades. She crouched down, pressing her palm against the warm earth. Somewhere beneath this soil lay the remnants of the White City, the gleaming complex of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition that had drawn 27 million visitors in just 6 months. 27 million people who walked through halls of polished marble, beneath domes that rivaled the Pantheon, past fountains fed by engineering that would challenge modern capabilities. And then, within a year of the exposition's closing, almost all of it was gone, demolished, burned, erased. The official explanation was simple. The buildings were temporary, constructed of staff, a mixture of plaster and fiber, designed to be beautiful but impermanent. They were never meant to last. They served their purpose and were removed to make way for progress. Eleanor had believed this explanation for most of her career. She had taught it to hundreds of students. She had written papers defending the conventional narrative. But 3 years ago, something had changed. A former student named Marcus Chen had sent her a package, a collection of original photographs from the exposition, purchased at an estate sale in Wisconsin. Most were unremarkable, the typical documentation of grand architecture and well-dressed crowds. But 3 of the photographs showed something that made Eleanor's hands tremble. They showed the buildings under construction, or rather, they showed what should have been construction. But the images made no sense. In one photograph, dated April 1892, just 14 months before the exposition opened, the massive administration building stood nearly complete, its dome already in place. Workers stood in the foreground, but they were not building. They were cleaning, polishing, finishing details on a structure that appeared, for all purposes, to already exist. In another image, laborers gathered around a section of ornate cornice work that had been, according to the caption, recently uncovered from beneath layers of soil and debris. Uncovered, not installed, not lifted into place. Uncovered, as if it had been buried there, waiting. The third photograph was the most disturbing. It showed a foundation being excavated, and within that foundation, clearly visible in the grainy, silver gelatin print, were the remnants of an older structure. Columns, arches, fragments of a building beneath the building, as if the White City had been constructed atop the bones of something that came before. Eleanor had spent the last 3 years following the thread that these photographs represented. She had traveled to archives in Washington, New York, and London. She had interviewed descendants of construction workers. She had examined engineering reports that contradicted the official timeline. And slowly, piece by piece, she had assembled a picture that challenged everything she thought she knew about American history. She was not alone in this pursuit. Across the country, in a cramped apartment in San Francisco, a man named Thomas Reeves was reaching similar conclusions through entirely different means. Thomas was 61, a retired civil engineer who had spent his career building bridges and highways throughout California. He had always possessed what his colleagues called an unusual sensitivity to structure. An ability to look at a building and understand, almost intuitively, how it was made and whether it was stable. 3 months before Eleanor's visit to Chicago, Thomas had been walking through the financial district of San Francisco when he stopped in front of a building he had passed thousands of times before. The old Federal Reserve Bank, constructed in 1924, stood at the corner of Sansom and Sacramento streets. He had never paid it much attention, but on this particular morning, something made him pause. The building was wrong, not structurally. It was solid, well-maintained, unremarkable in its neoclassical design, but Thomas found himself staring at the basement windows, at the way they sat just slightly too high above the current street level, at the proportions that suggested the building extended further down than the single basement level indicated in the architectural records. He walked around the block, examining the foundation from every angle, and the feeling only intensified. That evening, Thomas pulled the building's original construction documents from the city archive. What he found kept him awake until dawn. The plans showed a building with 2 basement levels, not one. The lower level was marked simply as existing foundation, to be incorporated. No further explanation, no indication of what that existing foundation was, or when it had been built, or why a federal building constructed in the 1920s would incorporate a foundation that predated it. Thomas began to research other buildings in the city. What he discovered was a pattern that defied explanation. Dozens of structures throughout San Francisco, banks, hotels, government buildings, showed similar anomalies. Foundations that were too deep. Basement levels that appeared in early photographs but not in later ones. Building permits that referenced existing structures on lots that were supposedly vacant. And then there were the photographs from before the earthquake of 1906. The great fire that followed the earthquake had destroyed most of San Francisco's records, creating a convenient gap in the historical documentation. But Thomas found images in private collections, in university archives, in the basements of old families who had lived in the city for generations. These photographs showed a San Francisco that looked nothing like what he had been taught. Grand buildings lined the streets, structures of such scale and sophistication that they rivaled anything in Europe. Domed halls, colonnaded walkways, towers that seemed to reach impossibly high, given the construction techniques of the era. And in photograph after photograph, the same pattern appeared. Workers cleaning, restoring, excavating, not building. As if the city had been found, not constructed. Inherited, not created. Thomas wrote a letter to the one academic he thought might understand, Dr. Eleanor Vance of Northwestern University, whose work on the Chicago Exposition he had discovered during his research. The letter arrived in Eleanor's mailbox on a Tuesday morning in April, and by Friday she was on a plane to San Francisco. They met at a coffee shop in the Mission District, 2 strangers bound by an obsession they could not explain to anyone else. Eleanor was reserved, academic, precise in her language. Thomas was animated, prone to tangents, his engineer's mind constantly seeking structural explanations for what they were discovering. But as they spread photographs and documents across the table, comparing notes and observations, a shared understanding emerged. Something had happened to America's cities. Something had been hidden, erased, written out of history. The magnificent buildings that appeared in 19th century photographs, the domed exhibition halls, the ornate palaces, the infrastructure of such sophistication, had not been built by the people who claimed credit for them. They had been inherited, cleaned, restored, and then, systematically, they had been demolished, burned, or buried. The question was, inherited from whom? Eleanor leaned back in her chair, exhaustion etched into the lines of her face. Outside the coffee shop window, San Francisco hummed with the energy of modern life. Cars, phones, the endless chatter of people who had no idea what lay beneath their feet. Thomas asked the question that neither of them had been willing to voice. What if there was a civilization here before? What if everything we think we know about who built America is wrong? Eleanor did not answer immediately. She thought of the White City, rising impossibly fast from the Chicago marshlands. She thought of the photographs showing workers uncovering rather than constructing. She thought of the patterns she had traced across the country, the same architectural styles appearing simultaneously in cities that should have had no connection, the same impossible timelines, the same suspicious demolitions. "We need more evidence," she finally said. "We need to go to the source. We need to find the cities they buried." Thomas nodded slowly. He had already begun to compile a list of locations, places where the patterns were strongest, where the anomalies were most pronounced: Philadelphia, Boston, Detroit, St. Louis, and one place that kept appearing in his research, a place that seemed to be at the center of everything, a small section of New York City where the buildings were too old, too sophisticated, and too deliberately hidden. They agreed to meet again in 2 weeks, after each had gathered more documentation. As Eleanor gathered her papers and prepared to leave, Thomas stopped her with a final observation. "The old maps," he said. "Have you noticed the old maps?" Eleanor frowned. "What about them?" Thomas pulled a folded reproduction from his jacket pocket, a map of North America from 1754, published in London. He spread it on the table and pointed to the interior of the continent, to the regions that should have been wilderness in the mid-18th century. "Cities," he said. "The old maps show cities, not settlements, not trading posts, cities, with names we do not recognize, in places where we are told no one lived." Eleanor studied the map, her heart beginning to race. Thomas was right. The cartographer had drawn urban centers throughout the Mississippi Valley, around the Great Lakes, along rivers that would not be explored by Europeans for another century. The names were strange: Tartaria, Mongol, Kingdom of the Great Khan, as if the mapmaker was describing a different world entirely. "These could be errors," Eleanor said, but her voice carried no conviction. "Cartographers made mistakes. They filled in blank spaces with imagination." Thomas shook his head. "These are not random imaginings. They are consistent across dozens of maps, from different publishers, spanning almost 100 years. They show the same cities, in the same locations, with the same names. And then around 1800, the cities disappear from the maps, just like they disappeared from the buildings, just like they disappeared from the photographs." Eleanor folded the map carefully and slipped it into her bag. She felt the weight of what they were suggesting, the implications that went far beyond architecture, far beyond history, into territory that challenged the fundamental narrative of American civilization. She stood and offered Thomas her hand. "2 weeks," she said. "I will see you in New York." As she walked out into the San Francisco afternoon, Eleanor Vance understood that her life had changed irrevocably. The questions she had spent 3 years avoiding could no longer be ignored. The evidence she had gathered demanded an explanation that the academic world would never accept, and the path she was now walking, a path toward truths that had been deliberately buried, would lead her somewhere she could not yet imagine. Behind her, the city gleamed in the California sun. Towers of glass and steel rose toward a cloudless sky, monuments to modern progress and technological achievement. But beneath those towers, beneath the streets and parking garages and subway tunnels, something older waited. Something that had been there before the Spanish missionaries, before the gold rush, before the earthquake and fire that had so conveniently destroyed the records. Something that remembered what had been erased. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you believe that history holds secrets that deserve to be uncovered, if you feel that the truth matters more than comfortable narratives, then join us on this journey. Subscribe now, because what we are about to reveal will change how you see the world beneath your feet. 3 months passed before Eleanor and Thomas met again in New York. The delay had been necessary. Thomas had suffered a minor heart attack in June, a warning from his body that the stress of their investigation was taking its toll. But even from his hospital bed, he had continued to gather evidence, directing his niece Rachel to photograph buildings throughout the Bay Area, to request records from municipal archives, to follow the threads he had identified. Rachel Reeves was 28 years old, a journalist for a small independent newspaper in Oakland. She had initially approached her uncle's obsession with skepticism, the natural caution of a trained investigator confronted with claims that bordered on conspiracy theory. But as she photographed the buildings Thomas identified, as she examined the architectural details he highlighted, her skepticism began to erode. The proportions were wrong, the basement windows that sat too high, the foundations that extended too deep, the decorative elements that showed wear patterns inconsistent with their supposed age. stones that should have been smooth after a century of exposure to salt air, but remained sharp-edged, as if they had spent most of their existence protected from the elements. Underground, buried. By the time Thomas was released from the hospital, Rachel had become a convert to the investigation. She accompanied him to New York, serving as both assistant and guardian, monitoring his health while cataloguing their findings. They arrived at Penn Station on a humid August morning and took a taxi to a residential hotel in the West Village, where Eleanor had rented a suite large enough to accommodate their research. The suite quickly transformed into a war room. Maps covered the walls, photographs spread across every horizontal surface. Books and documents formed precarious towers on the floor. Eleanor had spent the summer months expanding her research beyond architecture into municipal records, census data, and newspaper archives. What she had discovered was deeply disturbing. There were gaps, systematic gaps in the historical record that could not be explained by accident or negligence. Entire neighborhoods had been demolished between 1890 and 1920, ostensibly for civic improvement or fire safety. The buildings that replaced them were always simpler, smaller, less sophisticated than what came before. Photographs from the 1870s and 1880s showed a New York of stunning grandeur, buildings that rivaled anything in Paris or Vienna, but those buildings had almost universally been replaced by the squat, utilitarian structures that dominated the early 20th century. Even more troubling were the population records. Eleanor had compiled census data from New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Boston, tracking the growth of these cities through the 19th century. The numbers made no sense. Cities that supposedly grew from small settlements to major metropolises within a few decades showed population explosions that defied mathematical models of human reproduction and immigration. It was as if hundreds of thousands of people appeared from nowhere, filling cities that had sprung up equally inexplicably. Unless, Eleanor had written in her notes, the cities were already there, unless the population did not build the cities, but inherited them, moved into them, claimed them. Thomas studied her findings with the methodical attention of an engineer solving a structural problem. He asked questions about the data sources, the methodology, the potential for error. But with each question answered, his expression grew more troubled. The numbers supported their hypothesis. The evidence was consistent. Something had happened in America during the 19th century, something that had been covered up so thoroughly that even trained historians had missed it. On their third day in New York, they ventured into the field. Thomas had identified several buildings in Lower Manhattan that showed the characteristic anomalies: foundations too deep, proportions too grand, architectural styles too sophisticated for their supposed construction dates. They began at the old Customs House near Battery Park, a Beaux-Arts masterpiece completed in 1907. The building's official history was straightforward: designed by Cass Gilbert, constructed over 4 years, a monument to American commerce and government authority. But Thomas pointed out details that the official history could not explain. The foundation extended 60 feet below street level, far deeper than necessary for a 7-story building. The basement levels, visible through service entrances, showed construction techniques that predated the steel frame revolution of the 1890s. And the ornamental stonework, examined closely, revealed tool marks consistent with methods abandoned centuries before the building's supposed construction. They spent hours documenting everything: photographs, measurements, rubbings of the mysterious tool marks. By evening, they had compiled evidence suggesting that the Customs House, like so many others, had been constructed atop an older foundation, built upon the bones of something that came before. Rachel, who had been silent for most of the day, finally voiced the question that haunted all three of them. Who built the original structures? Who lived here before the cities we know? Eleanor had been wrestling with this question for months. The evidence pointed in a direction that seemed impossible, toward a civilization that had existed in North America before the accepted timeline of European settlement. A civilization sophisticated enough to construct buildings that rivaled anything in the old world. But such a civilization would have left traces beyond architecture. There would be records, artifacts, cultural remnants. unless those traces had been systematically destroyed. The thought chilled Eleanor. She imagined a conspiracy spanning centuries, involving governments and institutions across the globe, dedicated to erasing all evidence of a preceding civilization. It seemed paranoid, the stuff of fiction rather than historical research. But the alternative, that 3 trained investigators were all simultaneously delusional, seemed equally unlikely. Thomas suggested a different approach. Instead of speculating about who, he proposed they focus on what and when. What specific technologies had this hypothetical civilization possessed? When had they disappeared? The answers to these questions might provide clues to the larger mystery. They returned to the hotel suite and began to organize their findings into categories: architecture, infrastructure, energy systems, transportation. Each category revealed its own set of anomalies, its own unexplained contradictions. The infrastructure evidence was particularly compelling. Thomas had gathered photographs and engineering reports from across the country showing water systems, sewers, and underground tunnels that predated the cities they served. In Philadelphia, workers excavating for a new subway line in 1912 had discovered a network of brick-lined tunnels extending for miles beneath the city. Tunnels that appeared in no municipal records, that used construction techniques unknown to modern engineers. The discovery had been briefly reported in local newspapers, then never mentioned again. Similar discoveries had occurred in Boston, Detroit, and St. Louis. In each case, the pattern was the same: underground infrastructure discovered during modern construction, documented briefly, then forgotten or deliberately suppressed. The tunnels and water systems suggested a level of urban planning that should have been impossible for the colonial settlements that supposedly preceded the modern cities. Eleanor added another piece to the puzzle. She had found references in 19th-century newspapers to a phenomenon called the mud floods, events where cities across America had been buried under sudden deposits of soil and debris, forcing residents to rebuild at higher elevations. The official explanation attributed these events to natural causes: river flooding, volcanic eruptions, geological subsidence. But the pattern was too consistent, too widespread, too simultaneous to be explained by local phenomena. What if, Eleanor proposed, the burial was deliberate? What if something happened, some catastrophe or conflict that destroyed the original civilization, and the survivors buried what remained to hide the evidence? Thomas considered this hypothesis. It would explain the too deep foundations, he admitted. It would explain the buildings that appeared to be uncovered rather than constructed. It would explain the underground infrastructure. But it raises more questions than it answers. What catastrophe? Who were the survivors? And why would anyone want to hide evidence of a previous civilization? Rachel, who had been photographing documents throughout the evening, looked up from her camera. "Because the truth would change everything," she said quietly. "If there was a civilization here before, a sophisticated, advanced civilization that was somehow destroyed or erased, it would mean that everything we believe about progress, about history, about who we are, is wrong. It would mean that humanity has not been advancing steadily toward greater achievement. It would mean we might have fallen from something greater." The room fell silent. Outside, the sounds of New York at night filtered through the windows: sirens, traffic, the endless hum of a city that never slept. But in the suite, 3 people confronted implications that went beyond academic curiosity, beyond professional reputation, into territory that touched the foundations of human self-understanding. Eleanor finally spoke. "We need to go underground. We need to see what is buried beneath these cities. We need to find proof that cannot be dismissed or explained away." Thomas nodded slowly. He knew someone. A former colleague who now worked for the city's water department, a man who had access to tunnels and chambers that most New Yorkers never knew existed. He would make the call in the morning. That night, none of them slept well. Eleanor lay awake reviewing the evidence in her mind, searching for flaws in their logic, alternative explanations that would restore the comfortable certainty of accepted history. She found none. Thomas sat by the window, watching the lights of Manhattan flicker in the darkness, thinking about the city beneath the city that they were about to explore. Rachel wrote in her journal, documenting her transformation from skeptic to believer, knowing that the story she was uncovering might be the most important of her career, or the one that destroyed it. The morning came grey and humid, the city wrapped in a haze that blurred the boundaries between buildings and sky. Thomas made his call, and by noon, arrangements had been made. They would enter the tunnels that evening when the maintenance crews had finished their shifts, when the underground world of New York would be as empty as it ever got. Eleanor gathered flashlights, cameras, measuring equipment. Rachel packed emergency supplies, water, food, a first aid kit. Thomas consulted maps of the known tunnel systems, marking areas where he suspected older construction might be discovered. At 7 o'clock, they met Thomas's contact at an unmarked door near City Hall. The man's name was David Chen, no relation to Eleanor's former student, but the coincidence seemed somehow appropriate. David was nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder, speaking in hushed tones, even though no one else was nearby. "I can get you in," he told them, "but I cannot stay with you. What you are looking for, if it exists, is in areas that are not officially documented. Areas that my supervisors pretend do not exist. If you are discovered, I will deny any involvement. If you are injured, there will be no rescue. Do you understand?" They understood. David led them through a series of service corridors, past humming electrical equipment and pipes that carried the lifeblood of the city above. The air grew cooler as they descended, then warmer, then cooler again, temperature variations that reflected the geological complexity beneath Manhattan's surface. Finally, David stopped at a heavy steel door marked with warnings in 3 languages. Beyond this, he said, "You are on your own. Follow the left tunnel for approximately half a mile. You will reach a junction marked with old symbols, symbols that are not in any language I recognize. Turn right at that junction. After another quarter mile, you will find what you are looking for." He handed Thomas a key to the steel door. "Return it to the hiding place I showed you when you are finished. And be careful. There are things down there that I do not understand, things that should not exist." Before any of them could ask what he meant, David had disappeared back the way they came, his footsteps echoing briefly before being swallowed by the darkness. Thomas unlocked the door. Beyond it, a tunnel stretched into absolute blackness, untouched by the electric lights that illuminated the upper levels. Eleanor turned on her flashlight and stepped through. Rachel and Thomas followed. The descent into the true underground of New York had begun. The tunnel was older than anything Eleanor had seen in her decades of architectural research. The walls were not brick or concrete, but fitted stone, massive blocks joined so precisely that a sheet of paper could not slip between them. The ceiling arched overhead in a perfect curve, unmarked by the tool scrapes that characterized modern stonework. It was as if the tunnel had been carved from living rock by techniques that left no trace of their passage. Thomas ran his hand along the wall, his engineer's instincts struggling to comprehend what his fingers told him. "This is impossible," he whispered. "The precision required to achieve this. We do not have this capability today. Not without laser-guided equipment, computer modeling, material science that did not exist in any previous century." Rachel photographed everything, her camera's flash briefly illuminating sections of the tunnel that revealed even more impossibilities. Geometric patterns carved into the stone at regular intervals, channels running along the base of the walls that might once have carried water, or something else. Alcoves set into the walls at precise distances, their purposes unknown. They walked for what felt like hours, though Eleanor's watch showed only 40 minutes had passed. The tunnel sloped gently downward, taking them deeper beneath the surface of Manhattan, further from the world of light and noise and comfortable certainties. The air was cool and dry, carrying a faint smell that Eleanor could not identify. Something mineral, ancient, forgotten. David's junction appeared exactly where he had promised. The old symbols he had mentioned covered the walls from floor to ceiling. Not carved, but somehow embedded in the stone itself, as if they had grown there naturally. Eleanor photographed each symbol, recognizing patterns that resembled writing systems from cultures that should never have had contact, echoes of Sanskrit, of Egyptian hieroglyphics, of script she could not name. They turned right, as David had instructed, and the tunnel widened. The walls became smoother, the ceiling higher, until they emerged into a space that stopped all three of them in their tracks. It was a chamber, a vast underground chamber that extended beyond the reach of their flashlights in every direction. But it was not empty. Structures rose from the floor like the ruins of a buried city. Columns, arches, the fragments of walls that once enclosed rooms whose purposes they could only guess. And everywhere, the same impossible precision, the same fitted stone, the same geometric perfection. Eleanor sank to her knees. She had spent 3 years chasing evidence of a forgotten civilization, following threads of photographs and documents and architectural anomalies. But nothing had prepared her for this. Nothing could have prepared her for standing in the actual ruins of a city that should not exist, hidden beneath the streets of Manhattan, waiting to be discovered. Thomas moved through the ruins methodically, examining each structure with his engineer's eye. The buildings, if they could be called buildings, were unlike anything in the historical record. They seemed designed around principles that he could not identify, proportions that suggested functions beyond simple shelter or commerce. Some appeared to focus energy towards central points. Others seemed designed to capture and direct sound. Still others incorporated geometric forms that hurt to look at, that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of observation. Rachel documented everything, her camera capturing images that would challenge the foundations of historical understanding. But as she photographed, she noticed something that made her pause. The ruins were not entirely abandoned. Signs of recent activity marked certain areas. Footprints in the ancient dust, equipment that looked modern but modified, cables snaking toward power sources she could not see. "Someone else knows about this place," she said, her voice carrying strangely in the underground acoustics. "Someone is studying it, using it." Eleanor rose and examined the evidence Rachel had found. The footprints were fresh, within the last few weeks, perhaps days. The equipment included instruments she did not recognize, connected by cables that disappeared into openings in the ancient walls. Someone with resources and knowledge far beyond their own was conducting research in this impossible underground city. The implications were disturbing. If others knew about this place, if they were actively investigating it, then the suppression of evidence that Eleanor had documented was not historical accident, but ongoing policy. Someone, some organization, some institution was continuing to hide the truth about what existed beneath American cities. Thomas called out from deeper in the chamber. Eleanor and Rachel made their way toward his voice, navigating through the forest of ruined columns until they found him standing before a wall covered in text. Not symbols this time, but readable text, faded, weathered, but unmistakably English. The words made no sense. They spoke of technologies that did not exist, of energy drawn from the earth itself, of networks connecting cities across continents. They described a civilization that had achieved wonders beyond modern capability, that had built the structures Eleanor had spent her career trying to understand, and they described how that civilization had ended, not through gradual decline, but through sudden catastrophe, fire from the sky, water that rose without warning, earth that swallowed cities whole. And after the catastrophe, according to the text, came the erasure, the deliberate destruction of records, the burial of ruins, the rewriting of history to hide what had been lost. The survivors, a fragment of the original population, had been scattered, and their memories systematically suppressed. Those who inherited the ruins were told that they themselves had built them, that the impossibilities they lived among were merely monuments to human ingenuity. Eleanor read the text 3 times, memorizing every word. She photographed it from multiple angles, ensuring that even if the images were somehow lost, she would be able to recreate what she had seen. Thomas and Rachel stood in silence, absorbing revelations that challenged everything they believed about human history. "We have to share this," Rachel finally said. "We have to tell people what we found." But how? Thomas asked. Who would believe us? Who would publish this? The institutions that control historical narrative, the universities, the museums, the governments, they are the same institutions that have been suppressing this truth for centuries. They will not suddenly embrace evidence that proves their lies. Eleanor had been considering this problem for months. She had known from the beginning that whatever they discovered would face resistance, dismissal, possibly persecution. But standing in the ruins of a forgotten city, reading text that described the deliberate erasure of human memory, she understood that the stakes were higher than academic credibility. "This is not about us," she said. "This is not about being believed or vindicated. This is about truth. This is about understanding who we are and where we came from. This civilization, whoever they were, whatever they achieved, they deserve to be remembered. Their story deserves to be told." She turned to face her companions. "We will document everything we find. We will photograph every chamber, transcribe every text, measure every structure. We will compile evidence so overwhelming that it cannot be dismissed. And then we will share it, not through academic journals or mainstream media, but directly with people who are willing to question, who are willing to look beyond the narratives they have been taught." Thomas nodded slowly. The engineer in him recognized the logic of her approach. A single piece of evidence could be dismissed, but thousands of pieces, carefully documented and systematically presented, would create a weight of proof that could not be ignored. Rachel thought of her journalism, of the years she had spent learning to tell stories that mattered. This was the story of her career. Perhaps the story of any career. A story about what had been lost, what had been hidden, what might still be recovered. They spent 4 more hours in the underground chamber, documenting everything within reach of their flashlights. The ruins extended far beyond what they could explore in a single visit. Corridors leading to other chambers, passages descending to even deeper levels, structures whose purposes they could only guess at. But they gathered enough evidence for a beginning, enough to prove that what they had found was real. As they prepared to leave, to make the long climb back to the surface and the world of comfortable lies, Rachel paused before a section of wall where someone had scratched modern letters into the ancient stone. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her shiver. She photographed the warning and said nothing to the others. Some knowledge, she understood, was best kept private until its meaning became clear. If you are feeling something right now, if these words are stirring something in your memory that you cannot quite name, leave a comment saying, "I feel like I have always known this truth." Your comment might be the signal that helps others realize they are not alone in their awakening. The weeks following their underground expedition were consumed by documentation and research. Eleanor transcribed the text they had found, cross-referencing its claims against historical records from around the world. Thomas analyzed the structural evidence, creating detailed diagrams of the construction techniques they had observed. Rachel built a digital archive of their photographs, organizing them into categories that would allow others to understand what they had discovered. But they were not working in isolation. Their investigation had attracted attention that manifested in subtle ways at first, then with increasing directness. Eleanor noticed the same car parked outside her hotel 3 days in a row. Thomas received phone calls that consisted of silence on the other end. Rachel found evidence that someone had accessed her computer while she slept. They began to take precautions. They duplicated their research materials and stored copies in separate locations. They varied their routines, never meeting at the same place twice. They communicated through coded messages, aware that their conversations might be monitored. Despite these obstacles, or perhaps because of them, their investigation accelerated. The underground chamber had provided a framework for understanding the anomalies they had previously documented. The fitted stone, the impossible precision, the geometric principles, these were not isolated mysteries, but fragments of a coherent whole. A civilization that had mastered technologies beyond modern understanding, had once flourished in North America, had built cities of stunning sophistication, had achieved wonders that their inheritors could barely imagine. And then they had disappeared. Or rather, they had been disappeared, erased from history by forces that preferred humanity, ignorant of what had been lost. Eleanor focused her research on the question of the inheritors, the people who had moved into the empty cities, who had been taught that they themselves had built the wonders they inherited. She found evidence in census records, in immigration documents, in the archives of orphanages and poor houses. Massive population movements in the mid-19th century, not immigration from Europe, as the official narrative claimed, but relocation from elsewhere in America. People with no documented history, no family records, no memory of where they had come from. The pattern was clearest in the western cities. San Francisco, she discovered, had not grown organically from a Spanish mission and a gold rush boomtown. The city's early photographs showed structures that predated any documented settlement, buildings of such scale and sophistication that they could not have been constructed by prospectors and merchants living in tents. Yet by the 1850s, these buildings were occupied, functioning, integrated into the life of a city that supposedly did not exist a decade before. Where had the occupants come from? The records were deliberately vague. Ships had arrived in San Francisco Bay, carrying passengers whose origins were listed simply as elsewhere or various. Trains had delivered settlers whose tickets had been purchased by unnamed benefactors. Orphan trains had transported thousands of children with no documented parentage to cities throughout the West. Children who grew up believing they had simply been unlucky in their birth, never knowing that they might be survivors of a catastrophe that had destroyed everything their ancestors had built. Thomas pursued a different angle. He had become obsessed with the question of energy, how the underground chambers they had discovered had been powered, what technologies the lost civilization had employed. The channels running through the stone, the geometric patterns, the structures that seemed designed to focus and direct unknown forces, these suggested capabilities that modern science could not explain. But as he researched, he discovered that modern science had once been closer to understanding. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, inventors and researchers had developed technologies that seemed to tap into the same principles: wireless transmission of power, free energy drawn from the atmosphere, resonance systems that could affect matter at a distance. These technologies had been demonstrated publicly, documented in scientific journals, patented and prepared for commercial deployment. And then they had been suppressed. The inventors had been discredited, their laboratories destroyed, their patents purchased and buried. The official history of technology had been rewritten to exclude possibilities that challenged the emerging paradigm of centralized power generation and distribution. The energy systems of the lost civilization had been rediscovered briefly and then hidden again. Thomas found the name that appeared repeatedly in this history of suppression, not an individual, but an institution. A foundation established in the late 19th century with the stated purpose of advancing human knowledge, but which seemed to have spent much of its resources preventing certain knowledge from reaching the public. The Foundation's archives were sealed, its membership confidential, its activities shielded by layers of legal and political protection. He shared this discovery with Eleanor and Rachel during a meeting at a diner in Queens, chosen for its obscurity and its multiple exits. The Foundation, he explained, appeared to be connected to the same interests that had demolished the old buildings, buried the underground cities, and rewritten the historical record. If they could penetrate its archives, they might find documentation of the suppression, perhaps even records from the original civilization that had been preserved for the benefit of those in power. Rachel had her own contribution to the meeting. Her journalism contacts had connected her with a source, an elderly man who claimed to have worked for the federal government in a capacity he refused to specify. The man was dying, and he wanted to unburden himself of knowledge that had haunted him for 60 years. She had met with him 3 times, recording their conversations with his permission. What he told her confirmed and expanded everything they had discovered. The underground chambers existed beneath every major city in America, remnants of a civilization that had been systematically erased after what he called the reset. Government agencies had been studying these chambers since the 1940s, extracting technologies and artifacts that were then developed in secret programs and released gradually to the public under cover of invention and discovery. The atomic bomb, the man claimed, had not been invented. It had been reconstructed from principles discovered in the underground chambers. The same was true of computing, of telecommunications, of medical technologies that had revolutionized the 20th century. The progress that humanity celebrated as evidence of its own genius was actually inheritance, the gradual recovery of capabilities that had once been commonplace in a civilization far more advanced than anyone imagined. The man had one final revelation. The reset that had destroyed the original civilization had not been natural. It had been engineered, a deliberate catastrophe designed to eliminate a population that had grown inconvenient to interests beyond national or even planetary boundaries. The survivors had been permitted to continue only because they proved useful, their memories erased, their identities reconstructed, their descendants taught to believe in a history that had never occurred. Rachel asked who had engineered the reset and who had decided which survivors would be spared. The man had only smiled sadly and said that some questions were dangerous to answer. He had said enough, he told her. He had said more than he should have. Whatever happened next was no longer his responsibility. He died 3 days later. His apartment was emptied before Rachel could return to retrieve the recordings of their conversations. The files on her computer had been remotely deleted. The only evidence of their meetings was her handwritten notes, which she had learned to keep on her person at all times. The 3 investigators met that evening in Eleanor's hotel suite, surrounded by the materials of their research, confronting the scope of what they were attempting. The mystery had grown beyond architecture and history into territory that touched the foundations of human civilization itself. They were not merely documenting forgotten buildings. They were uncovering evidence of a catastrophe that had reshaped the world, that had erased entire populations, that had been perpetuated by institutions still active in the present day. Eleanor spoke first. "We are in over our heads," she admitted. "Whatever we have discovered, whatever we think we know, there are others who know more. Others who have been protecting this secret for generations. Others who will not hesitate to silence us if we become too much of a threat." Thomas agreed. But he also pointed out that they had already crossed a line. They had entered the underground chambers. They had documented what they found. They had shared information with others. Even if they stopped now, even if they destroyed their research and pretended ignorance, they were already compromised. The only path forward was the one they had chosen, to gather evidence, to share it widely, to create a record that could not be erased. Rachel thought of the warning scratched into the underground wall. "They are still watching." She thought of the elderly man who had died after sharing his secrets. She thought of the car that followed Eleanor, the silent phone calls to Thomas, the intrusion into her own computer. "Then we need to be smarter than they expect," she said. "We need to move faster, share wider, make it impossible to silence us without drawing attention to the very secrets they want to protect." They began to plan. They would divide their evidence and distribute it to contacts around the country, journalists, researchers, activists who had shown willingness to question official narratives. They would publish online, in formats that could be copied and shared beyond anyone's ability to control. They would create a network of believers who could continue the investigation, even if the original 3 were silenced. It was a desperate strategy, but it was the only one they had. The truth they had discovered was too important to die with them. The civilization that had been erased deserved to be remembered. The lie that humanity had been living deserved to be exposed. As they worked late into the night, preparing the first distribution of their findings, none of them noticed the van that had parked across the street from Eleanor's hotel. None of them saw the figures who watched the windows of her suite, recording the movements of shadows against curtains. The watchers were patient. They had been watching for a very long time. They could wait a little longer. The following months saw the investigation expand beyond anything Eleanor, Thomas, or Rachel had imagined. Their initial distribution of evidence reached hundreds of recipients, researchers, journalists, curious individuals who had long suspected that the official history of civilization was incomplete. These recipients shared the materials with others, who shared them further still, creating a network of investigation that spanned the country and eventually the globe. Reports began to arrive from other cities, other countries. The underground chambers were not unique to America. Similar structures had been discovered beneath London, Paris, Moscow, Tokyo. Wherever investigators looked, they found evidence of the same lost civilization, the same impossible architecture, the same deliberate erasure. The reset had been global, affecting every continent, erasing the memory of an entire world. Eleanor coordinated the American investigation from a small house in rural Vermont, chosen for its isolation and its limited digital connectivity. She had learned to be cautious with electronic communications, relying instead on postal mail and face-to-face meetings. Her academic career was effectively over. Northwestern had declined to renew her position after the publicity surrounding her research, but she had found a new purpose that made professional concerns irrelevant. Thomas had returned to San Francisco, working with a team of engineers and architects who were mapping the underground infrastructure beneath the city. His health had stabilized, and the work gave him an energy that his family had not seen in years. The discoveries his team made confirmed and expanded the evidence from New York. Tunnels extending for miles, chambers of unknown purpose, technologies embedded in the stone that defied modern understanding. Rachel had become the voice of the investigation, publishing articles and producing documentaries that reached audiences in the millions. Her journalism background served her well, allowing her to present evidence in ways that engaged rather than overwhelmed, that invited curiosity rather than dismissal. She had also become the target of coordinated attacks, accusations of fraud, attempts to discredit her sources, legal threats from institutions she had never heard of. But each attack only increased public interest in her work. The three investigators met in person only rarely now, aware that their gatherings attracted surveillance, but they communicated constantly through their network, sharing discoveries and coordinating responses to the growing opposition. The watchers had not been idle. Websites had been taken down. Sources had been intimidated. Several investigators on the periphery of the network had experienced accidents or illnesses that seemed too convenient to be coincidental. But the truth continued to spread. With each person who examined the evidence and found it compelling, the network grew stronger. With each failed attempt at suppression, public awareness increased. A tipping point was approaching. A moment when the accumulated evidence would become undeniable, when the official narrative would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. That moment came unexpectedly, in the spring of Eleanor's 61st year. A construction crew in Philadelphia, excavating for a new underground shopping complex, broke through into a chamber that should not have existed. The breakthrough happened in the middle of a workday, witnessed by dozens of workers and captured on multiple cameras. Before authorities could respond, before the site could be sealed and the witnesses silenced, images of the chamber were uploaded to social media and shared around the world. The chamber was vast, larger than anything previously discovered, containing structures that dwarfed the ruins beneath Manhattan. And on its walls, clearly visible in the photographs, were texts in languages that scholars could not identify, alongside images that depicted technologies and events beyond modern understanding. The official response was swift and predictable. Authorities claimed the photographs were fabricated. The construction site was sealed, the workers dispersed, the chamber filled with concrete before any independent investigation could be conducted. But it was too late. The images had spread too widely to be suppressed. Questions that could previously be dismissed as conspiracy theory were now being asked by mainstream journalists, academics, ordinary citizens who had seen with their own eyes evidence of something impossible. Eleanor watched the controversy unfold from her house in Vermont, feeling vindication mixed with anxiety. The moment she had worked toward for years had arrived, but it brought dangers she could not predict. The institutions that had maintained the secret for centuries would not surrender their control willingly. Whatever came next would be shaped by their response. Thomas called from San Francisco, his voice carrying an excitement tempered by caution. His team had been approached by several former government officials who wanted to share information anonymously. What they revealed confirmed the dying man's claims from years before. Programs studying the underground chambers, technologies extracted and developed in secret, a coordinated effort spanning decades to maintain control of knowledge that could transform human civilization. One of the officials had provided documents, internal memos, classified reports, budgets for programs that officially did not exist. The documents referenced the lost civilization directly, using terminology that suggested detailed knowledge of its history, its capabilities, its destruction. They also referenced ongoing efforts to suppress public awareness, strategies that had been employed for over a century and were now being intensified in response to the growing threat of disclosure. Rachel prepared to publish these documents, knowing that their release would accelerate the confrontation that had been building for years. She had moved her operations to a location she did not share even with Eleanor and Thomas, understanding that the coming days would bring dangers that required separation and redundancy. If she was silenced, others would continue. If the documents were seized, copies existed in a dozen other locations. On the night before publication, Rachel received a visitor, a woman in her 40s, expensively dressed, carrying herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to power. She arrived at Rachel's door without announcement, without apparent fear of the security measures Rachel had implemented. "You do not know who I am," the woman said, "but I know everything about you. I know what you have discovered. I know what you plan to publish, and I am here to tell you that you are making a mistake." Rachel invited her in. Curious despite her caution, the woman sat in the only comfortable chair and studied the room with an appraiser's eye before continuing. "The civilization you have uncovered was real. The reset that destroyed it was real. The suppression you have documented is real. On these points you are entirely correct. But you do not understand the reasons. You do not understand what you are threatening to release." She leaned forward, her gaze intense. The lost civilization was not destroyed by accident or by enemies. It was destroyed by choice, a choice made by its own leaders, after they discovered something that made continuation impossible. The reset was designed to preserve what could be preserved, to give humanity a second chance in ignorance rather than extinction in knowledge. What you call suppression is actually protection. What you call lies is actually mercy. Rachel asked the obvious question. "What did they discover?" The woman smiled sadly. "That is precisely what I cannot tell you. The knowledge itself is the danger. The lost civilization fell because they learned something that humanity was not ready to know, something that made their technology possible, but also made their destruction inevitable. The same knowledge is embedded in the chambers, in the texts, in the technologies you have been documenting. If that knowledge spreads, if it reaches a public unprepared to handle it, the result will be the same catastrophe that ended the civilization you admire." She stood and moved toward the door. "I am not here to threaten you. I am not here to silence you. I am here to ask you to consider what you are doing. The truth you seek is real, but it is not liberating. It is a burden that destroyed everyone who carried it before. Before you share it with the world, ask yourself whether the world is ready. Ask yourself whether you are willing to be responsible for what follows." She left without another word, disappearing into the night, as mysteriously as she had arrived. Rachel sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by the documents she had planned to publish, confronting a possibility she had never considered. What if the suppression was not malevolent? What if the lies were designed to protect rather than control? What if the truth they had uncovered was dangerous, not because of who knew it, but because of what it was? She called Eleanor, then Thomas, sharing the encounter and its implications. They debated through the night, weighing their commitment to truth against the warning they had received. In the end, they reached a decision that would define everything that followed. They would publish. Not because they dismissed the warning, but because they believed that humanity deserved the choice. The lost civilization had been destroyed by knowledge they were unprepared to handle, but the suppression that followed had made that preparation impossible. If humanity was to ever grow beyond the limitations of its manufactured ignorance, it needed access to the truth, all of it, including the dangers. The documents went live the next morning. Within hours, they had been downloaded millions of times. The confrontation that had been building for years had finally arrived. And somewhere, in the underground chambers beneath a dozen cities, in the archives of institutions that had guarded secrets for centuries, in the corridors of power where decisions were made that affected billions of lives, the Watchers began to act. 1 year had passed since the publication of the documents. The world had changed, not in the dramatic, catastrophic way the mysterious woman had warned, but in subtler, more profound ways that Eleanor was still struggling to understand. She stood in the Philadelphia chamber, now open to carefully managed public tours after months of legal battles and political pressure. The concrete that had been poured to seal it had been excavated, revealing structures even more extensive than the original photographs had suggested. Teams of archaeologists, engineers, and historians worked throughout the space, documenting discoveries that rewrote the understanding of human history. The texts on the walls had been partially translated, revealing a narrative that confirmed what Eleanor's research had suggested. A civilization of unprecedented sophistication had flourished across the globe thousands of years before the conventional timeline of human development. They had mastered technologies that modern science was only beginning to understand. Energy systems that drew from the Earth itself, construction methods that worked with matter at fundamental levels, communication networks that operated beyond physical constraints. And then, as the mysterious woman had suggested, they had discovered something. The texts were vague about what exactly they had found, but the implications were clear. Their discovery had revealed a truth about the nature of reality that could not be reconciled with continued existence as they had known it. Faced with this truth, their civilization had fractured, some choosing to use the knowledge regardless of consequences, others attempting to suppress it, still others withdrawing entirely from the physical world. The result was the reset, not a single catastrophe, but a cascading series of events that had reshaped the planet over a period that the texts estimated at several decades. By the end, the civilization was destroyed, its survivors scattered, its knowledge fragmented and eventually forgotten. What followed was intentional. The survivors, who had opposed the use of the dangerous knowledge, established institutions to ensure that it would not be recovered, at least not until humanity had developed the wisdom to handle it. These institutions had persisted across millennia, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining their core purpose. The suppression that Eleanor had documented was their work, continued through generations by descendants who had largely forgotten the original reasons for their secrecy. The publication of the documents had disrupted this ancient arrangement. The institutions had been forced into the open, their activities exposed to public scrutiny. Some had disbanded entirely, others had transformed, shifting from suppression to managed disclosure, accepting that the secrets they had protected for so long could no longer be maintained. The dangerous knowledge itself remained hidden. The texts that explained it most directly had been removed from the Philadelphia chamber before it was opened to the public. Removed, Eleanor suspected, by the institutions that still possessed the capability and the will to protect certain secrets. But the evidence of its existence was now public, and researchers around the world were working to reconstruct what had been taken. Eleanor was not among them. She had come to accept the mysterious woman's warning, not because she trusted those who had delivered it, but because her own research had revealed the wisdom it contained. The lost civilization had been destroyed by knowledge they were unprepared to handle. Humanity today might be no more prepared. The work of disclosure was necessary, but it needed to proceed carefully, giving societies time to develop the understanding and the institutions that would allow dangerous knowledge to be handled responsibly. Thomas had returned to engineering, leading a team that was adapting technologies discovered in the underground chambers for modern applications. The energy systems of the lost civilization, it turned out, could be replicated using contemporary materials, not at the scale or efficiency of the originals, but sufficient to demonstrate their principles. His work promised to transform the energy infrastructure of the planet, reducing dependence on fossil fuels and centralized distribution networks. Rachel had continued her journalism, becoming the leading chronicler of what was increasingly called the Great Remembering. Her work documented the ongoing discoveries, the political and social implications, the personal stories of people whose lives had been transformed by the revelation of hidden history. She had received threats and suffered setbacks, but the tide of disclosure had grown beyond any individual's ability to stop. The three investigators, the professor, the engineer, the journalist, had changed the world. Not through dramatic confrontation or spectacular revelation, but through patient documentation, persistent publication, and the simple refusal to accept lies as truth. They had joined a tradition that stretched back through history, connecting them to everyone who had ever questioned official narratives, who had ever insisted that the evidence of their senses mattered more than the claims of authority. Eleanor turned from the chamber wall she had been studying and walked toward the exit. Outside, the Philadelphia sky was grey with autumn clouds, the air carrying the first chill of approaching winter. The city stretched around her, buildings of glass and steel standing alongside structures of fitted stone, the old and the new coexisting in uneasy combination. She thought of all the cities across America, across the world, where similar combinations were now being recognized. The inheritance of the lost civilization was everywhere, hidden in plain sight for those who knew how to look. The domes and columns that had been dismissed as 19th-century affectation were actually echoes of something far older and far more sophisticated. The underground chambers were not anomalies, but remnants of a global infrastructure that had once connected the planet. And the people who lived in these cities, the inheritors who had been taught to believe they had built what they actually found, were finally learning the truth about who they were and where they came from. It was not a comfortable truth. The revelation that human history was far stranger than anyone had imagined, that entire civilizations could be erased and forgotten, that the progress humanity celebrated might actually be recovery from catastrophic loss. These were ideas that challenged fundamental assumptions about identity and purpose. Many people resisted them. Some would resist them forever, preferring the comfortable lies to the troubling truth. But Eleanor had faith in humanity's capacity to grow, to adapt, to find meaning in even the most challenging revelations. The lost civilization had fallen because they discovered something they could not handle. But their descendants, the inheritors, the survivors, the people of the modern world, had an advantage their predecessors lacked. They were approaching the dangerous knowledge slowly, carefully, with the accumulated wisdom of the ages of ignorance that had followed the reset. Perhaps this time the story would end differently. She walked through the streets of Philadelphia, past buildings whose foundations extended to depths that modern construction records could not explain, past monuments whose true age was only now being recognized. The city hummed with the energy of modern life, cars and phones, and the endless activity of a civilization that was finally beginning to understand its own history. Somewhere beneath her feet, in chambers that still held secrets yet to be discovered, the echoes of the lost civilization waited. The geometric patterns that encoded their knowledge, the technologies that had powered their wonders, the warnings they had left for those who would follow, hoping that the next cycle of human civilization would succeed where they had failed. Eleanor Vance did not know whether that hope would be fulfilled. She did not know whether the dangerous knowledge, when finally understood, would destroy humanity or transform it. She did not know whether the Great Remembering would lead to a new golden age or simply repeat the catastrophe that had ended the age before. But she knew that the truth mattered. She knew that the lies humanity had been living were corrosive to the soul, that the suppression of history was a form of violence against the collective memory of the species. She knew that whatever came next, it would be built on honesty rather than deception, on understanding rather than ignorance. And that, she believed, made everything they had risked worthwhile. If you watched this far, It is because this story touched something in you, a memory perhaps, or a longing for truth that you have always carried. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far, so I can get to know you, so I can know who really appreciates the stories on this channel." We are building something together, a community of those who remember, who question, who refuse to accept the lies we have been told. If this story moved you, if it made you think about history and truth in new ways, please give it a like and share it with others who deserve to hear it. The more people who see this, the harder it becomes to suppress the truth we are uncovering together. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, do it now. The journey we have begun is far from over. There are more hidden cities to discover, more buried truths to uncover, more lies to expose. Subscribe and be part of the great remembering. Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, keep remembering what they tried to make you forget.